The fire did not start with flames, it started with a memory, one that refused to fade, one that stayed long after the night had ended, long after the voices had gone quiet, long after everything else had moved on as if nothing had happened. Welcome to Story of the Black Past, where we uncover hidden stories, powerful truths, and forgotten moments from history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Stay until the end, because this story will keep you thinking. You will not want to miss a single moment. Now relax, remove all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. In the rural stretches of Mississippi, where plantations stood surrounded by open land and quiet darkness at night, there lived a man called Samuel, a name he carried not as identity alone, but as memory, because everything else had been taken or changed over time. Samuel was not loud, not known for resistance, not the kind of man overseers watched closely. And that was his strength. He worked, moved, spoke only when needed, because silence creates space, and space allows observation. He had seen what happened that night, not from far, not as rumor, but directly, and what he saw did not leave him. It stayed, quiet, heavy, unmoving. Someone close to him had been taken, not suddenly, but in a way that stretched, in a way that showed power, in a way that made it clear there would be no consequence. That moment did not create anger alone. It created something deeper, something controlled, something patient. Because Samuel understood something early, that reacting immediately would change nothing, but waiting, learning, understanding could change everything. The plantation moved as it always had on the surface. Work continued, orders were given, voices carried, but Samuel began to see it differently, not as a fixed system, but as something made of parts, connected, dependent, and therefore vulnerable. He watched the routines carefully. Who stayed where at night, who guarded which areas, where light remained, where darkness settled, because night is not empty, it is full of opportunity, if understood correctly. The main house stood at the center, not just as a place to live, but as a symbol of control, of authority, of everything the system depended on, and symbols, when removed, create more impact than anything else. Samuel did not act quickly. Days passed, then weeks, then longer, because planning requires time, and time was something he used carefully. He began small, not with fire, but with movement, testing spaces, understanding how the land changed at night, how sound carried, how footsteps could be hidden, because action without knowledge creates failure. But action with knowledge creates outcome. He noticed something important. The night guards were not consistent, some nights stronger, some nights careless. Because routine creates weakness, people become comfortable, predictable, and predictable systems can be changed. Samuel waited for that moment, not forcing it, not rushing toward it, because forcing timing creates mistakes, and mistakes end everything. The first time he approached the main structure, it was not to act, it was to observe, to stand in the shadows, to feel the space, to understand the distance between safety and risk. And that moment told him everything, where the openings were, where the blind spots existed, where movement could happen without being seen. He stepped back, left, unnoticed, because the first step is not action, it is understanding. And as he returned to his routine, as nothing seemed different on the surface, something had already begun, not visible, not known, but real, because the plan was no longer an idea, it was forming. And as the nights passed, as the moment drew closer, as the system continued, unaware, one truth became clear. This was not going to be sudden, it was going to be precise, and when it happened, it would not just be an act, it would be a message, one that could not be ignored. The plan did not depend on fire alone, it depended on timing, direction, and control, because Samuel understood that fire without structure becomes chaos, and chaos can expose the one who created it, but controlled fire, placed carefully, becomes something else, something precise. He began to study the main house more closely, not openly, not in a way that could be noticed, but through routine, through the natural movement of his work, passing near it, observing without appearing to observe, because attention is dangerous when it is seen. He learned the rhythm of the place, when lights went out, when doors were secured, when movement stopped completely, because every place has a moment, a point in time, where it becomes most vulnerable. And that moment was what he waited for. The guards were not consistent. Some nights they moved more, spoke more, stayed alert. But other nights they slowed, their attention faded, their steps became less careful. Their focus turned inward instead of outward. Samuel did not act on strong nights. He waited for weak ones. Because strength resists, but weakness allows entry. He also understood the structure itself, the way it was built, the materials used, the points where fire would not spread quickly, and more importantly, the points where it would, where wood was dry, where air moved through gaps, where a small flame could become something larger. He did not need a large fire. He needed the right one. He gathered what he needed slowly, not all at once, not in a way that could be noticed, small amounts, taken from different places, carried in routine, hidden within ordinary movement, because anything gathered too quickly creates suspicion. Everything he did blended into normal life. That was his protection. The nights continued, unchanged on the surface, but inside him, everything was aligning. The moment came without announcement, not marked by anything unusual, not signaled by any clear sign, but recognized by him. Because he had watched long enough to know, the guards were quiet, too quiet, their movement minimal, their attention low. The house settled into stillness, the kind of stillness that hides vulnerability. Samuel moved, not quickly, not slowly, but with control, each step placed with intention, each movement measured, because now there was no room for error. He approached from the side he had studied, the one with the least visibility, the one where shadows held longest, where sound did not carry as easily because he had tested it. He did not go directly to the center. He moved along the edge because edges are where systems break. The first placement was small, careful, not meant to be seen immediately. Then another, in a different point, because a single fire can be stopped, but multiple points create confusion, and confusion prevents control. He worked quickly, but without panic, because panic creates mistakes, and mistakes create sound. Everything remained quiet, still, unnoticed, until it began. Not suddenly, not with explosion, but with a change, a shift, smoke first, then light, then movement, inside, then outside. The guards reacted, but not together, not immediately, because confusion had already begun. Where is it? How did it start? Which direction? Those questions delayed action, and delay allowed the fire to grow. Samuel stepped back, already moving away, before the full reaction began, because his goal was not to watch, it was to act and leave. The fire spread, not uncontrolled, but wide enough, strong enough to take hold, to disrupt, to force response, to break routine. Voices rose, movement increased, but without coordination, because multiple points create division. The guards split, some moving one way, others another, and in that split, control weakened. Samuel disappeared into the darkness, not running, not rushing. Because calm movement does not draw attention, he returned to where he would be expected, blended back into the routine, before the full scale of the event became clear. By the time the fire was fully seen, fully understood, he was no longer near it. He was part of the system again, invisible. The plantation changed that night, not destroyed entirely, but shaken, disrupted, forced into reaction, and reaction breaks control. Samuel did not celebrate, did not show anything, because showing creates risk. Instead, he observed, again, watching how they responded, how they spoke, how they tried to regain control, because this was not the end, it was the beginning. The system had been touched, and once a system is touched, it becomes vulnerable. The fear began, quiet, unspoken, but real, because something had happened, something planned, something precise, and they did not know how or who, and that uncertainty was more powerful than the fire itself. The reason behind what Samuel had done did not begin with the fire, it began long before, in moments that had settled into memory, moments that did not fade, moments that shaped how he saw everything that followed. He remembered clearly, not every word, not every detail, but enough to understand that what had been done was not sluchai, not necessary, but chosen, carried out with certainty, without thought of consequence. Someone close to him had been taken in a way meant to send a message, meant to create fear, meant to show control, and for many it worked, but for him it created something else. Clarity. Not anger alone, but understanding. Understanding of how the system worked, who made decisions, who carried them out, who believed they would never face consequence. And that understanding was what guided him. The fire had not been an end. It had been a signal, a disruption, a way to create space, and now, within that space, he could continue, not with the same method, because repetition creates patterns, and patterns lead to discovery. Instead, he shifted, changed approach, adapted, because survival depends on variation. The plantation after the fire was not the same. The routines had been shaken, the guards more alert, the masters more cautious, but that caution was not perfect. It was uneven, inconsistent, and within that inconsistency there were openings. Samuel watched closely, again, observing how they responded to what had happened, where they focused attention, where they ignored, because after a disruption, people overcorrect in some areas and neglect others. That imbalance creates opportunity. He began to act again, not with fire, but with interference, small changes, carefully placed, at critical points, tools misplaced, timing altered, communication interrupted, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to create repeated problems, repeated confusion, because confusion weakens structure. One overseer made a mistake that cost time, another misjudged a situation, another failed to follow through correctly. Each event small, each one explainable on its own, but together they began to form something, a pattern, not clear, not proven, but felt. The masters began to notice, not fully, but enough to question, because things were no longer running smoothly, no longer predictable, no longer certain, and certainty was what they depended on. Samuel never repeated the same action, never created a clear line between events, because his strength was not in what he did once, but in how he adapted. Each action different, each outcome separate, but all leading to the same result, instability. The overseers began to watch each other. Blame shifted, voices changed, because when something goes wrong without clear cause, people look for someone, and that search breaks unity. One overseer lost position, another faced scrutiny, another began to doubt his own decisions, and that doubt spread quietly through the system. Samuel remained still on the surface, working, moving, speaking only when needed, because invisibility was protection. He did not rush, did not try to destroy everything, because destruction draws attention, but slow weakening goes unnoticed until it is too late. Months passed, and the plantation carried a different feeling, not visible to outsiders, but present within. A tension, a lack of trust, a quiet awareness that something was wrong, but no one knew where to look. And that was his advantage, because as long as they looked outward, they would not look inward. As long as they searched for something visible, they would miss what was hidden. But suspicion does not remain without direction forever. It begins to narrow, to focus, to search more closely and slowly, without clear reason, without clear evidence. Attention began to shift, not fully, but slightly, towards those who had access, those who moved freely, those who were always present, and that included him. Samuel felt it, not through words, but through behavior. Through the way some eyes lingered longer, through the way some questions carried more weight, and he understood. The balance was changing again. The space he had moved in was becoming smaller, more dangerous, more watched, and now the next decision would matter more than anything before, because continuing could expose everything, but stopping would leave the system weakened, unstable, changed. And as that moment settled, as the year moved forward, as everything balanced on choice, one truth became clear. He had already done enough, but the question remained: would he stop or take one final step? The moment came quietly, not with accusation, not with a crowd, but with something far more dangerous, a tension that had begun to settle, not randomly, but with direction, with purpose, and that made it harder to escape. One of the overseers, not the most powerful, but the most observant, had begun to notice small things, not the events themselves, but the pattern of access, the way certain disruptions seemed to connect to spaces where only a few people moved freely. Samuel had been careful, extremely careful. But even the most careful movement, over time, leaves something behind, not proof, not certainty, but enough to create suspicion. And suspicion does not need evidence to grow. It needs only repetition. The overseer began to watch him, not openly, not in a way that would alert him immediately, but quietly, closely, in the same way Samuel had once observed others, watching his movement, his timing, his presence in different spaces, looking for something, anything. That did not match. Samuel felt it, not in words, but in the way the air shifted around him, in the way certain eyes stayed longer than before, in the way simple questions carried more weight. He did not react, did not change suddenly, because sudden change confirms suspicion. Instead, he remained consistent, steady, unmoved, because consistency hides truth. The overseer chose his moment carefully, approaching him during routine, during work, during a time that would not draw attention, where questions could be asked without raising alarm. His voice was calm, controlled, but searching. He asked simple things. Where had he been? Who had he seen? What had he been doing at certain times? Questions that meant nothing on the surface, but everything beneath, because they were not about information, they were about reaction. Samuel answered, measured, balanced, not too quick, not too slow. Because timing reveals more than words. He did not avoid the questions, did not show discomfort, because avoidance creates focus. Instead, he gave what was expected, nothing more, nothing less. The overseer stepped closer, reducing the space between them, not aggressively, but intentionally, watching his face, his posture, his hands, looking for a sign, a mistake, a hesitation. But none came, only calm, only control, only the same presence, and that created something unexpected, doubt, because suspicion without confirmation weakens. It does not disappear, but it loses strength. The moment stretched, longer than it should have, filled with tension neither of them showed, because both understood something. The line had been reached, the edge of discovery, and it had not been crossed. The overseer stepped back, not convinced, but not certain, and uncertainty delays action, delays consequence, and delay creates survival. Samuel returned to his routine, unchanged, unaffected on the surface, but inside, everything had shifted, because now, he knew, the space he had used was no longer safe, not fully, not completely. The overseer continued to watch him in the days that followed, not as closely, not as directly, but enough to keep the possibility alive, enough to ensure that the risk remained, but without new events, without continuation. The suspicion could not grow, it remained, but it did not advance, and that was enough. Samuel made his decision then, not out of fear, but out of understanding, that continuing would not strengthen what he had done, it would expose it, and exposure would end everything. So he stopped, not suddenly but completely. No more interference, no more disruption, no more action, only stillness, only routine, only invisibility, and that stillness protected everything he had already created, because what he had done was already working. The system had been weakened, trust had been broken, certainty had been replaced, and that change would continue without him. The plantation settled into a fragile balance, not the same as before, not as controlled, not as certain, but stable enough to continue, yet unstable enough to never fully recover. And Samuel remained within it, unseen, unknown, but no longer powerless, because true power is not always in what you continue to do, it is in knowing when to stop. The aftermath did not come with answers, it came with silence, the kind of silence that spreads when something has happened but no one can fully explain it, when people feel the change but cannot point to its source. The plantation continued, work resumed, orders were given, voices returned, but nothing felt the same, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be seen but could be felt. The overseers moved differently now, not openly afraid, not in a way they would admit, but with caution, with a hesitation that had not existed before, because too many things had gone wrong. Too many moments had not made sense. They began to watch each other, not fully trusting, not fully certain, because when a system weakens from within, the first thing it loses is unity. And without unity, control becomes fragile. The masters spoke less openly about what had happened. They did not name it, did not describe it fully, because to do so would be to admit that something had occurred beyond their understanding, something they could not control. Instead, they reduced it to coincidence, to error, to chance. But their actions told a different story. They changed routines, increased attention, adjusted behavior, because even without admitting it, they knew something had been wrong. Among the enslaved, the change was noticed in a different way, not through explanation, not through clear understanding, but through feeling, through the way certain punishments became less frequent, through the way hesitation appeared where there had once been immediate action. No one spoke of it directly, because speaking creates risk, but it was understood, quietly, carefully, that something had happened, something that had shifted the balance. Samuel did not speak of it, not once, not even in private, because silence was his protection, and his silence made the story stronger, because people began to fill the space with their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own understanding of what might have caused the change. Some believed it was luck, others believed it was error. Some believed it was something unseen, but all of them felt it. The overseers began to treat Samuel differently, not with kindness, not with open respect, but with distance, with a level of caution that had not been there before, because something about him did not fit anymore. Something about his presence felt steady in a way that made others uncertain, and uncertainty creates space. He was no longer pushed the same way, no longer tested in the same way, because those who had begun to suspect him never found proof, and without proof, they could not act. But suspicion, even without evidence, changes behavior. Time passed, weeks turned into months, and the events that had caused the disruption faded from immediate memory, but not from impact, because impact does not disappear, it settles, it becomes part of how people think, how they act, how they respond. The plantation was no longer what it had been, not completely, not fully, because something inside it had been altered, something that could not be restored to its original state. The trust between overseers weakened, the confidence in the system reduced, the certainty gone, and that change was lasting. Samuel continued his life within that same world, not free, not outside of it, but no longer defined by it in the same way, because he carried something that could not be taken away, the knowledge of what he had done, of how he had done it, of how he had changed something without being seen. That knowledge became part of him, part of how he moved, part of how he understood everything around him. And that understanding was power, not loud, not visible, but real. The plantation remained, the system continued, but beneath it, there was something else. Something quiet, something unseen, something that had changed, and would not return to what it had been. The legacy did not rise as a story spoken loudly. It did not travel in clear words or written records. It settled quietly into the space, into the behavior of those who lived there, into the way things were done without anyone fully explaining why. The plantation continued as it always tried to, holding on to its structure, its routines, its sense of control, but beneath that surface, something had shifted, something that could not be undone, because once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it remains. The overseers carried that doubt with them, not openly, not in a way they would admit, but in the way they moved, in the way they hesitated before making decisions, in the way they looked at each other with less trust than before. They no longer acted as one. They no longer believed fully in the strength of their system, because something had shown them that it could be affected. Quietly, without warning, without clear cause, and that realization stayed. The plantation itself felt different, not in structure, not in what could be seen from the outside, but in atmosphere, in the way tension sat just beneath the surface, in the way routine no longer felt completely secure. Among the enslaved, the story lived in a different form, not as a full account, not with clear beginning and end, but in fragments, in understanding, in the quiet recognition that something had changed. No one spoke Samuel's name openly in connection to it, but his presence was felt, in the way people looked at him, in the way they noticed his calm, in the way he moved without fear. And that difference was enough, because people do not always need proof. They understand through feeling, through observation, through the way something shifts. He became something more than a man within that space, not a figure spoken about, not a name carried in open conversation, but a symbol, a reminder that the system was not unbreakable, that control was not absolute. He did not claim it, did not show it, did not use it to draw attention, because drawing attention creates risk. Instead, he remained quiet, steady, invisible, and that invisibility protected him. Time passed, new overseers arrived, others left. The details of what had happened faded, but the effect remained, because it had settled into behavior, into habit, into the way decisions were made. The masters never acknowledged it openly, never admitted that something had shifted beyond their control, but their actions revealed it. They became more cautious, more controlled, more aware of the possibility that not everything could be predicted. And that awareness changed them, even if they did not understand why. The system remained. But it was not the same, because something inside it had been touched, something had been altered, and that change could not be reversed. Samuel continued his life within that same world, not free from it, not removed from its limits, but no longer the same, because he carried knowledge, not just of what he had done, but of what was possible. That knowledge stayed with him, not as something to show, but as something internal, something steady, something that could not be taken away. And that is how his story survived, not through records, not through loud telling, but through impact, through the way it shaped understanding, through the way it remained, even as time moved forward. In the end, the story did not remain as something written or clearly told. It became something quieter, something carried in memory, in behavior, in the way people changed without always understanding what had caused it. The plantation continued, as systems like that often do, holding on to its structure, its routine, its belief in control. But beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Because once uncertainty enters, once doubt takes root, it becomes part of everything that follows. The overseers never spoke of the events in a way that gave them clear shape. They did not describe what had happened as a single cause, because to do so would mean admitting that something had moved beyond their understanding, something they could not control. But their actions revealed the truth. The hesitation before decisions, the caution in places where there had once been certainty. The quiet awareness that something unseen had changed the way things worked. Among the enslaved, the story lived differently, not as a loud tale, not as something repeated openly, but as a quiet understanding, passed carefully, carried in fragments, in moments where people recognized that something had shifted. Samuel's name was not spoken loudly in connection to it, but his presence remained within the story, in the idea that someone had acted, someone had moved carefully enough to remain unseen, someone had changed something without ever being discovered, and that idea was powerful because it showed something deeper, that even in a system built on control, there are limits, there are spaces where that control weakens, there are moments where understanding becomes stronger than force. Samuel continued his life within that same world, not free from it, not outside of it, but no longer defined by it in the same way, because he carried something others did not, the knowledge of what he had done, of how he had done it, of how he had changed the system without being seen. And that knowledge stayed with him, not as something to show, but as something steady, something internal, something that could not be taken away. Time passed, people changed, the details faded, but the impact remained because it had settled into behavior, into thought, into the way people acted even when they did not know why. And that is how stories like this survive, not through records, not through loud telling, but through presence, through meaning, through the way they shape understanding long after the moment has passed. So when you think about this story, do not only think about the fire, do not only think about the disruption, think about what it reveals, what it teaches, what it proves about power, about patience, about the ability to understand a system deeply enough to change it without being seen. Because that is where the real story lives, not just in what happened, but in what it changed. Thank you for watching Story of the Black Past. If you stayed until this moment, I truly appreciate you. Tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and the time. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this, stories that go deeper, stories that uncover what has been hidden. And remember this, the strongest actions are not always loud, they are not always seen, but when they are guided by understanding, by patience, by purpose, they can change everything, even in silence. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried weight, it carried memory, it carried something that could not be easily explained, because what had happened did not leave clear evidence, it left impact. The days continued as they always had, work resumed, voices returned, movement filled the space again, but underneath all of it, something remained unsettled, something that could not be named but could be felt. The plantation looked the same from a distance. Nothing had changed in structure. Nothing had been removed, but the feeling within it was different. The overseers walked with more awareness, their eyes no longer passing over details without thought, their steps no longer as certain, because once doubt enters, it does not leave completely. It stays, in small ways, in quiet pauses, in moments where they question what they once accepted, and that questioning was the mark left behind. Samuel moved through that space as he always had, quiet, steady, unnoticed by those who did not look closely, but those who had begun to look, saw something different. Not something they could name, but something they could feel, a calm, a steadiness, a presence that did not shift with fear, and that created distance. They did not confront him, did not accuse because they could not. There was nothing to hold, nothing to prove, only a feeling, and feeling is not enough for action, but it is enough to change behavior. The pit of silence that followed the events became its own kind of story, not spoken, not written, but carried, passed in glances, in half words, in the way people understood without explanation. Among the enslaved, the understanding grew stronger, not through details, not through full knowledge, but through recognition, through the awareness that something had shifted in a way that mattered. No one needed to say it, because they could see it. In the hesitation of those who once acted without thought, in the space that had opened where none existed before, and that space was enough. Samuel did not build on it, did not expand it, because he understood that what had been done was complete, that pushing further would risk everything, but leaving it allowed it to grow, naturally, quietly, without resistance. Time moved forward, seasons changed, people came and went, but the effect remained, not as a sharp memory, but as a settled truth that the system, though still standing, was not untouchable, that control, though still present, was not absolute, and that understanding stayed long after the moment had passed. Samuel carried his life forward, not free, not beyond the reach of the system, but changed because he had seen something others had not, he had understood something others ignored, and he had used that understanding to create something that could not be undone, and that knowledge was his, not visible, not spoken, but real and lasting, because true change does not always announce itself, it does not always demand recognition. Sometimes it settles, quietly, deeply, until it becomes part of everything that follows. So when you remember this story, remember not just the act, not just the moment, but the meaning, the understanding, the patience behind it. Because that is where its power truly lies, not in what was seen, but in what remained, and what remained changed everything.